Today we talk about what does it mean when cells divide? What does it mean by cell death? We tackle this in embryo culture today. I'm Dr. Mark Amols, and this is Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday. The other day, I had a patient ask me if we could possibly freeze her embryos after they stalled. And at first I was kind of shocked by that, thinking, why would she want to freeze an embryo that's not growing anymore? And then I realized most people don't understand that when an embryo stalls, it's actually not alive. But when you think about alive or dead, we think of it from a human standpoint. We think about that we talk, that we move, that our heart goes. But when you're talking about cells, it's a little bit different because we can't see the organelles moving. So the only thing we can do is look at its progression of division. After an egg fertilizes, the cells will continue to divide and keep dividing until a baby is born. When the embryo is in culture, we look at this division to determine if the embryo is growing at the right pace and if the cells are growing in a healthy manner. Today we'll talk about what it means when cells are not dividing as fast. What does it mean if there's fragmentation or asymmetry? And what it means when embryos stall. In the last episode to talk about Fertility Tuesday, we talked about fertilization and what we expected to see on day 1, which is 2 polar bodies and 2 pronuclei. Now, let's start with the next day, which would be day 2. Now, many clinics don't look at embryos on day 2, but I want to at least make sure you understand what to expect if they do. On day 2, we expect the cells to divide to either 2 to 4 cells. That would be a normal number. Then, on day 3, we expect that number to be the 4 to 8 cells. Now, sometimes it may be a little bit behind, or it could be further ahead. And if, let's say, on day 3 there are 12 cells, it's not so much concerning, but it could mean there's an issue. The same thing if there's only 2 cells on day 3, then we would be very concerned that the embryo is not growing or is delayed in growing. Now on the 4th day, the embryo undergoes a transition from being very cellular to then becoming more developed. And this causes compaction into a morula. Because you can't see cells because everything is condensed together, morulas are very difficult to grade. By day 5 or 6, your embryo should be at the blastocyst stage. In this stage, there are cells that are on the outside, which are called trophectoderm cells, which will become the placenta. And then there are cells on the inside, which we call the inner cell mass. Those will develop into the baby. In the blastocyst stage, there are different stages of the blastocyst. When it's very early and compact, when it starts expanding and breaking out of its zona pellucida, which is called hatching. Sometimes blastocysts can take up to 7, even 8 days to become a blastocyst. Now, it is concerning when it's growing slower. As a matter of fact, most clinics won't freeze embryos on day 7 or 8, especially if you're not doing some type of chromosomal testing, such as PGT-A. The reason for this is because most embryos that go to day 7 or even 8 are going to likely be aneuploid, meaning abnormal chromosome numbers. However, if they are genetically normal when it comes to chromosome numbers, the chances of success are decent, but it's still less than an embryo on day 5 or 6. That is euploid, meaning normal chromosome numbers. Now, when the early grading is done, such as when you are at day 3 or day 2, you can't tell which cells are going to be the embryo and which ones are going to be the placenta. And for this reason, you're grading more the cells and how they look compared to each other. So you're looking at things such as, are they symmetrical with each other? Or are they asymmetrical? Do they have fragmentation, which are tiny bits of cytoplasm that escape during cellular division and stay within the embryo? The last thing we look at is the number of cells on day 3. And using those 3 parameters, we can determine if the embryo appears to be in a good state. At the blastocyst stage, now we are looking more at if these cells have made a trophectoderm, if the cells have made an intracellular mass. We still look at asymmetry, we still look at fragmentation, but it's not as important at this point because the cells have differentiated themselves into the different parts of the embryo. Now grading is dependent on how cellular the trophectoderm is, how compact the intracell mass is, and how big it is. So now that we've talked about the progression of the division during the embryo culture, let's talk about what it means when it's going slow, when it's going fast, and when it seems to stop. Now, most of us understand slow growth. If on day 3, there are only 2 cells, then we know the embryo is going slow. Now, the thing I want to make sure you understand is no one just throws that embryo away. Sure, we're concerned about it, but we watch it. Sometimes these embryos catch up. Other times they continue to go slow. These are sometimes the embryos that take to day 7 or day 8 to become a blastocyst. Other embryos can grow very fast. For example, on day 3, you could have a morula, and that is a concerning sign because the embryo should not be dividing that fast. And a lot of times that means something is wrong. What is most important to understand is that your clinic is not going to discard your embryo just because it's going slow or just because it's going fast. If it stops growing, that is a different situation. Now, how do we know it's not growing anymore? Well, because when we look day to day, we can then determine if the embryo kept growing. So for example, if on day 5 you had an early blastocyst that's very compact, and on day 6 you look, and now it's still the same early blastocyst and hasn't grown at all, then you would call that a stalled embryo. Same thing if you see an embryo that's a morula on day 5, and the next day 6 you look, it's still a morula, you can consider that embryo has stalled. And what does it mean to be stalled? It means the embryo is dead. Now, if you don't do anything with that embryo, it's going to start breaking down within the next day. Although we can't see the breakdown at that moment, it has already happened. And so in that situation where the patient was asking to freeze that embryo, it wouldn't make sense because the embryo is already dead. If you froze it, it probably won't even survive the thaw. And if it does survive the thaw, it won't keep growing because it's already shown it's not going to grow. Embryos do not stop growing and then restart again. Another area I see patients get concerned about is if it's taking longer to become a blastocyst. Now, we've already talked about day 7 and day 8. Yes, those are a little bit further and usually have a slightly lower pregnancy rate than embryos that become blastocysts on day 5 and 6. But some people get concerned that a day 6 embryo is not as good as a day 5 embryo. And the important part here is to understand when did it make it to what stage at what time. Because, for example, if an embryo is, let's say, an early blastocyst on day 5, and you're not doing PGTA testing, you could just freeze the embryo that day. But if you were doing PGTA testing, they may need to wait till the end of the day or the next day because they need the embryo to expand to become hatching so they can then remove the cells for the biopsy. This is different than an embryo that only made it to the early blastocyst on day 6 because now it took longer to get to that point. So it's important to understand that to do a biopsy, you really need the embryo further along. To not do a biopsy, you can freeze the embryo at an earlier stage. In the end, what all this means, embryos going slow, going too fast, stalling, usually has to do something with the DNA. Embryos that are euploid, meaning normal chromosome numbers, usually will keep going on, make it to the blastocyst stage, and be frozen or transferred. But embryos that go slower or go faster usually have some type of problem. And therefore, although we want to preserve every embryo, freezing an embryo that stalls is not worth it because those embryos are usually abnormal. Now, although we haven't done a large study on this, we did do a small pilot study and looked at embryos that stalled. And what we found was that almost all of the embryos that stalled were abnormal. This isn't surprising because that's what we would expect, but at least shows you that those embryos have stalled for a reason. And you don't need to be worried that a potential good embryo is just taking a rest and is about to start growing again. I want to make sure you know that I get it. I've been there. I remember when my wife and I went through IVF, we put back 2 embryos, and then I heard that the 3rd embryo was discarded. And what was interesting about this was it wasn't discarded because it was a bad embryo. It was discarded because in this clinic, that's what they do. If the embryo was a slightly poor quality and it was on day 3, they discarded it. Now, for a couple that can only make 3 eggs and can barely get any embryos to make it to the end, we were honestly upset, thinking, why wouldn't they at least give it a chance? Now, years later, I have more understanding, and I understand a little bit better now because at that time, we didn't have the ability to really grow out to day 5 very well. And so there was a reason why those embryos were discarded. But it is nerve-wracking when anything is discarded and it's hard for you to get to that point. I get that. And so today I wanted to make sure to explain it to you so you understand that if the embryo stalled, it's not alive anymore. And keeping it would do you no good. Obviously, not everything I do is done at other clinics. There may be clinics out there that do discard embryos that are growing slower. I'm not aware of it, but that would be something to ask your clinic. I hope this episode was useful for some people. I know it helped me understand perspective when the patient asked me that. I kind of always assumed the patients knew that when the embryo stalled, it was dead, which is why I always appreciate questions because it also lets me know what my patients know. I look forward to talking to you again next week on Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.